And I had guys that could run that protocol for 2 years straight without breaks. And I had other guys who could do it for 6 weeks. And then you see
what
that,
would be the factor that you have to stop? How would you know you're going to stop?
So what I noticed is a lot of guys, instead of ramping up their steroid dosages, you ramp up the growth hormone and the insulin, and assuming that health parameters are okay, the growth just continues. But things like lipids and overall hematocrit and all these things are a little bit more manageable. Of course, the volume that they get from that it would go away when you discontinue the insulin and the growth hormone, and then you're left with less, but still significantly more. Not a significantly more amount of muscle that you would expect from that dose of steroids alone. And it's a little bit hard to quantify because everybody responds differently. So as I go through my protocols, I realize that less steroids is probably healthier and better, less ventricular hypertrophy, less long-term stress on your blood pressure and organs. And then the growth hormone, the insulin, and the IGF-1 seems to improve the muscularity without really detracting from the organs.
Yeah, man. The insulin is one that's like it's a tricky one, right? Because elevated insulin levels obviously is going to do a lot of damage to the arterial walls, and if I'm here for any reason, talking to these young bodybuilders, it's like you can do this in a healthy way and still be really big and still be really successful. You just need to know what you're paying attention to. So, like high dose insulin, there's only one time I did high dose insulin for any amount of time is because I was working with Milos. And I would, looking back on it, that was probably, high dose. I don't know if it's the same as what you would call high dose, but 20 I use
40 to 80 per day.
Yeah. So I would use 20 I use twice a day actually, no, he wanted me to use it like, I think during and then after, maybe before, during, I forget, but about 40 I use usually once a day. And I was like, man, looking back on it, I think that was a mistake to my health. Steroids, I don't really believe steroids are that negative to people's health unless you're obviously abusing it, driving up blood pressure, obviously throwing off hematocrit levels. But I see guys using steroids and living well into their 70s and 80s. And like, that's, I don't know, in my mind, I don't know that that's the biggest area of concern. I think it's the abuse of it that becomes a concern.
Yeah.
So, so if you're using 3 grams of test, then you probably have a problem with your hematocrit. You probably have a problem with your blood pressure. If you're doing excessive amounts of, things that are driving up hematocrit, yes. But for me, insulin, I don't know, man, just like what I know now around insulin's potential damage on the arterial walls, I'd love to hear your feedback on like, is it as bad as, in my mind I've created it to be, or is it actually like, it's probably not doing that much as long as it's not crazy amounts?
Yeah, I think as long as it's not crazy amounts. So I would recommend like a long-acting insulin, like Lantus, for example, to have a basal insulin support. So you always have this little bit of glucose management in the background.
So of course, lower.
Yeah, it's lower, but also, it prevents these crazy high peaks and fluctuations. So we're talking about 10, 20 IUs of basal insulin, and then maybe 5 to 10 IUs pre-workout or post-workout, whatever you prefer, of a fast-acting insulin in the form of Humalog. And that will be it. So we're talking anywhere between 15 to 25 IUs for a period where insulin sensitivity is sustained. Now, of course, that really depends on your diet, how much cardio you're doing, if you're taking insulin sensitizing micronutrients like magnesium, vitamin D3, all those little simple things. And then you kind of track the biofeedback. And I had guys that could run that protocol for 2 years straight without breaks. And I had other guys who could do it for 6 weeks. And then you see
what would be the factor that you have to stop? How would you know you're going to stop?
So you would see fasting blood glucose levels start to rise, even though they're on the basal insulin level. And then the triglycerides would start to rise, and you see the lipase and the amylase levels start to get a little bit off because there's a little bit of stress on the pancreas. Okay, you need to do a reset, mini diet, take the insulin out, maybe use berberine, metformin in extreme cases, reduce the carbs by half, do a little bit more cardio, and then start again. And of course, everybody's so different. So that's why bodybuilding is so weird, because you would like to set these guidelines, but it's almost impossible, because I know guys that run heavy cycles, 2.5 grams, high dose growth hormone, insulin left and right, and their blood work parameters don't change. Their heart is normal size. They don't have any fatty liver. There's no inflammation on the kidneys. So some guys seem to be a lot more resilient to higher dosages and abuse than other guys. And that's why it's so difficult sometimes to believe the IFB pros saying that they run 1.5 grams a year and 6 IUs of growth hormone, because the next guy like me, for example, I
Twice
would
that.
not. I would need to take twice that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
So it
yeah.
actually brings up a good question, Steve. I'm curious how much you're looking into the genetics, right? So I've been studying genetics
Yeah.
pretty exhaustively at this point, and
Mm.
like, can we start to differentiate? When people say, "quote unquote," that guy's got good genetics, that guy got bad genetics, there's an enormous number of SNPs that fall in, or
Yeah.
that fall into, or genes that fall into that category. Like the things that people aren't thinking about, like insulin sensitivity, protein turnover, inflammation. There's mitochondrial effectiveness and biogenesis, and like so many genes that play into this this blanket term that gets thrown out of like, hey, this guy has good genetics, bad genetics. I think there's an opportunity to start looking at objectifying that and going, hey, based on your genes, you need to do this more, and based on your genes, you do that more. That's why I became very interested in fitness genes,
Yeah.
and I'm working with them to sort of help bring more of their information to the fitness community.
Yeah. Unfortunately, that's like the last roadblock for me. So I haven't looked into the genetics yet. I already want to have a firm grasp on the pharmacology and the drug interactions. But into the genetics, I haven't looked into it yet. So I haven't done my own DNA test, and I'm not really familiar with the S&Ps. But I think at one point in time, I will kind of go in that direction. I still have like 25 deep dives left to do about particular compounds that are popular, just to make sure that everybody has all the information presented to them with the citations, so they can make the best decisions. So it might be another year before I get into the genetics. So what have you found
Cool.
up until this point? Because it seems
Not
like
much,
a
man.
huge
Like,
learning curve.
huge. Yeah. I mean, I'll be doing it for the next 10 years, but I think there's an opportunity to do it for the next 10 years.
Yeah.
I think it's not going to go away. It's not like it's a fad. I mean, being able to look at somebody's genes and say, hey, the blessing of what I have right now is I'm exposed to these Oxford geneticists, and I can talk to them about, hey, this client is experiencing this thing. For example, I don't know, maybe someone's having a hard time losing fat. They're in deficit, they're training, they're not losing fat. So we can look at their genetics and find out specific patterns that are appearing to be like, oh, they need to do this. And I would never be able to look at their genes and determine what possible, interaction of the genes is causing some type of resistance, or maybe they're taking, for example, BCAAs, and that's causing some type of downstream negative effect that's preventing their body from releasing fat, as an example. So I think this is sort of the new frontier, right? We can look at drug interactions, we can look at blood lipids, we can look at blood work, and give us a pretty good idea. But there's still these obscure cases where you're like, nothing's happening, nothing's working for this person, or like, how can we do it in a way that doesn't require them to do things that are dangerous? I think it's a really interesting next frontier for optimization and performance.
Yeah, what I found problematic now is that the S&Ps, a lot of them are not really mapped. And there's so many of them that you would almost need some sort of AI to kind of interpret what does what and how they interact.
It's being
with
done,
each other.
right? They're calling it a digital twin, Steve. So you'll upload your DNA into this system, and it basically has like Steve as an AI, or Steve as a digital version of you. And then you could say, based on your genes, based on your blood work, based on all your historical blood work, they're kind of creating this digital physiology. And so we can say, hey, enter it, put in this vitamin or this molecule or this pharmaceutical, and we can actually look and see what happens within your genetics based on your digital twin. And that seems to be the future of sort of personalized medicine and pharmacology.
Yeah, especially if you can combine that with drug interactions and pharmacology that people like to take, which is hard because there's so many experimental compounds out there that people take that have very little scientific evidence behind them, especially in humans. So that makes it a little bit difficult. But if that could be developed over the next 10 years, it would take a lot of guesswork out of it. Because I always feel that in bodybuilding, we're kind of guessing.
Yeah, they're further ahead than we think. So I had a guy on the podcast a couple months ago who was telling us that it's like they're pretty far ahead with this digital twin thing.
Okay.
Which is super exciting because it may actually, it's interesting because it may actually change research, right? So if you think of sort of scientific research, and if you have these digital twins, you no longer need the cohort. You just need the data. You just need the technology, right? You don't need an actual live person. You can just do it directly on the computer. That certainly changes the potential trajectory of scientific research, right? I think is really fascinating.
Yeah, so you could just simulate a scenario and then use your digital twin to kind of, okay, what would happen if I go eat donuts for 10 days? So arbitrary.
Yep.
Okay, do I get, insulin resistance? But at least it would motivate you not to book that, 10-day excursion on a cruise and then you eat at the hotel buffet like an asshole because you know exactly what's going to happen because you simulated.
Sounds like you're talking from experience here, buddy.
I've been there, yeah. This is how it got big. A lot of good food in Vegas, that's for sure. Now, that sounds very interesting, so I'll definitely have a look in that. But it's the genetics. Every time I wanted to get started, I looked at it, I'm like, man, this is such a big learning curve. It would, it would take me years to, really go through it. And since I have so much left to do in the pharmacology aspect regarding harm and risk mitigation, I think it's better if I kind of complete my task there, which I'm about 50% done with the deep dives that I wanted to make. Yeah.